Welcome to our pod, and by that I mean on Wednesdays we read. I'm Hannah.
I'm Laura.
And we are two best friends who usually do a deep dive into new book series, one book at a time. But today we are three
best friends
because we are welcoming to the podcast Talia Dutton, a cartoonist, illustrator, and professor based out of Wisconsin, who wrote a great graphic novel called M is for Monster. Talia, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are so excited to have you on. I adore this book. We didn't really read.
This book is so sweet. I loved it.
We didn't really read graphic novels before we started doing the podcast, but now we've like converted. We both love them. And so I was so excited to read your book and have you on. So this book, M is for Monsters, is a children's and YA literature graphic novel that has a lot of diverse representation in media and all of the things. This is a debut novel, and it depicts a scientist bringing her younger sister back to life with unexpected results.
Talia, before we get into the book, can you tell us a little bit about you as a reader and maybe some of your favorite books or maybe like childhood favorites?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up huge reader, would come back from the library with stacks and stacks and stacks of books. My parents are great lovers of my mother loves fantasy books, all the classic fantasy novels. And she and my dad both love murder mysteries. So it's still a great love for both of those genres in me. Growing up, I think my favorite author was probably Tamora Pierce. I absolutely just ripped through her entire canon of work when I was in elementary and middle school. Absolutely sort of changed how I just approached the world. I really love Mercedes Lackey and books like that. My mother actually named me after the main character of the first series that Mercedes Lackey wrote, the Arrows of the Queen series. So that's the kind of nerd family that I'm coming from. And I guess I always bring up, when I talk about M is for Monster, when I talk about stuff that I read, I always bring up Eva Ibbotson, who wrote a lot of children's fantasy novels that were really like, I think it's like The Secret of Platform 10 or something like that, that it's a lot of like found family monsters and ghosts and like all these sort of misfits coming together and living together and finding all this like joy in each other's differences that I think was really with me as I approached sort of starting to tell my own stories.
We can definitely relate to Eva Ibbotson because we actually collab with another podcast, some friends of ours, and we read Witch Witch recently. And neither of us had read this previously, but our friends were like, we loved this as kids. And Hannah and I read it as adults. We're like, this book was so good.
It was so good. You also are just like speaking our language because we also covered a Tamora Pierce one, Wild Magic, which was, I read the Wild Magic ones, none of her other ones, which were actually probably better because I remember the Wild Magic kind of. The Alana ones seemed amazing. Wild Magic, I remember I was a huge horse girl growing up.
That would do it. That series would then absolutely get you.
But I remember like even as a young child reading it and being like, isn't the age gap with her and her tutor way too big for them to get together at the end of the
it's that is my favorite Tamora Pierce series. That one really got me. But again, it's one of those things where I'm like, I'm going to look at this so fondly and really, really try to ignore this big old chunk of the last book.
I'm pretty sure we revealed to Laura on the podcast where we're like, so she ends up with him. And she was like, what? Like, that's so upsetting. So.
Yeah.
I had no recollection of those books.
It's much different when you read it as an adult. You don't have the nostalgia factor weighing in, but
more shock.
And what got you interested in graphic novels as kind of a medium?
Yeah, so in addition to shelves stocked full of murder mysteries and fantasy novels, my parents had a huge collection of different kinds of comics. They had a lot of like collections of syndicated newspaper comics that I sort of browse through growing up. Like they had a lot of Baby Blues and For Better or For Worse, and like Foxtrot and stuff like that I poured through. So that and like Asterix and Obelix and Tintin and other sort of European style comics were always kind of there. And so I grew up reading them even sort of before I could read. I have memories of like sitting with my parents or with my grandmother and having them read sort of the dialogue to me out loud as we followed along. And like I said, my parents were both huge nerds. So they started getting me like collections of comics from the library, like old superhero comics that now that I think about it, I think were for them to read, but I would immediately like grab them and go.
Of course.
These are definitely for Talia. They're not for us.
This was in my stack. Yes, my stack of books, not your stack of books. So I've read so many different kinds of comics, all different sort of age ranges and genres and stuff like that. But I remember going to the library when I was little and being kind of like, there's not a lot of stories told through comics that I'm really excited about. Like, I rarely saw myself in any capacity. There was like, on sort of one level, there were very few stories about like middle school aged girls. There weren't a lot of stories about sort of queer characters or characters of color, people who looked like me, people who thought like me. It was easy to find superhero comics, and I loved those, but there weren't a lot of stories that were really geared towards me. And as I grew up, there's been this huge burst of stories that are really fitting that niche and that genre. And so, even though a lot of it is for young adults or middle grade stuff, I just absolutely gobble up at all of these amazing new sort of one-shot complete story graphic novels that are coming out these days. So I've loved them forever, and I think I ended up in college realizing I went for a degree in visual art, because I knew I liked art, but I didn't really understand a lot of the sort of more abstract kinds of art or contemporary art that other students were going for. I was really just like, I just want to tell stories. And I think words and pictures work together really well to make stories. Yeah. So I was already making little comics, sort of one-off things, and I decided I wanted to dive in, and I went to a grad program for comics, which is where everything kind of really exploded around me of my awareness of all this stuff and all the new books and everything that I could love.
That's awesome. Amazing. So as a writer and artist, what is your process like for creating a book? We often talk to authors about like being plotters or pantsers, but I'm kind of curious like how crafting a graphic novel is different and what the timeline and publishing process kind of looks like.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, I don't fully understand my own personal process. M is for Monster is the first long form graphic novel I've ever made. I think prior to that, the longest thing I'd ever written were 24-page comics that I did for like the 24-hour comic day, which does not involve any kind of thought process whatsoever, because you're trying to make a 24-page comic in 24 hours. So there's no planning, there's no plotting, there's no pantsing. It's just it's beyond pantsing. It's just go. And it's go while you're very sleep deprived.
Is that like streaking? Like you're just
yeah. There's no we're so far beyond pants at this point. So I came at it from every single angle possible. I drew thumbnails, I did like free writes, I pulled stuff together. I think ultimately I ended up starting with a plan and a script, because that was the part I was most scared about. I always knew that I wanted to be an artist of some kind, but I'd never really anticipated being the writer for my own art. That wasn't something I'd planned on. So I was most scared of writing not just dialogue, but like plots that made sense and fit together and worked and felt balanced and like they had rhythm. So I spent the most time on that. I think I signed I was approached by Mariko, who was my editor, because she taught a class. Mariko Tamaki taught a class at my grad program and approached me and said, I'm starting an imprint. Would you be interested in publishing this sort of what you're working on as your thesis? So it was kind of a sideways approach for me that somebody approached me rather than me going for an agent and approaching it through that angle. And she helped guide me through creating a pitch that she eventually brought then to the acquisition board of Shirley Books, which is her imprint at Abrams. And they gave me a contract saying, okay, this is when the book is going to be published. It's going to be published in 2022, and that's when it's going to come out, and this is when stuff needs to happen. And I spent probably an entire year just writing and revising the script after that point, just pushing it over and over and over again, trying to get it to make sense, which meant we actually ended up getting really tight when it came to actually drawing the dang thing, which is what I was most excited about. But it was also kind of like that was perpetually, that's a treat for later. I have to figure this thing out, and then I'll get to that point later on down the line. And actually, when it came down to it, both because I had no choice, and also because this was finally familiar territory for me, I think I drew the whole thing from like starting to think about visuals at all to the final sort of finalized inked lines that I sent in like 10 months, which is, I don't recommend as a process.
I ended up fast.
Yeah, it was fast. I mean, I go fast when it comes to thumbnails, which is sort of the first step of thinking about things on a page, laying out images, planning, how do you want to break up the dialogue? How do you want to break up the script? What are you looking at in each panel? That part goes pretty fast for me. And then I would break down everything sort of beyond that, try to into what I would call rough pencils, which is figuring out how to draw everything, like genuinely like taking it. Now we're looking at a full page. How do I make sure that table looks fine? How do I draw, what background is this going to be? All of those pieces. And then there's some refining stages in there and typing everything out, making sure the text is in the right place. And then going in once all that finalized and polishing all the lines and inking it. I actually ended up having to get some assistance with inking this book because I was running out of time. And they were great. It was mostly just me sending stuff and somebody sending stuff back to me going like, here, we've, all the lines where we could tell what you were doing. We've added those in there. And then I had a separate colorist who worked on that. But all this to say that I've only done the whole process once. And so now as I try to approach telling more stories and doing the process again, I still feel like I'm winging it. I've tried looking into more structure and plot and stuff. And I honestly think that just kind of paralyzed me in a lot of ways, this sort of idea of a set structure. So I'm trying to loosen up more recently and just start drawing stuff and see what happens, and let the story kind of follow the drawing rather than the other way around.
That's so fun. No, and I think that's good to make sure you're happy with the process. I did hear you talk at an event, and so there you mentioned that someone asked about why you chose like the turquoisey color, and you said, well, you only got to pick two colors, and one of them was black. Yeah. And so I was wondering, was there anything else about the like publication process that surprised you? Kind of like the oh, you only get two colors for this, so pick one and stick with it.
Yeah. I think there's all these like little bits and pieces. Like you don't think about the physical construction of a book very often, or at least I don't think about the physical construction of a book very often. So there's like, you have to have a certain number of pages in order for, because pages are folded in half and you've got a back and a front and all those things, you have to reach a certain amount. So if you have 116 pages, they're like, okay, well, we're gonna have to bump this up to this number so that we have enough pages and all that. So it ended up being, I think my full story, when I laid it all out, ended up being like a little bit longer than one of those cutoffs. And so they were like, all right, we're gonna have to fill the rest of this in with something. And I think ultimately we ended up just breaking down the story so that it was a little bit longer. But I was, for a while, I was like, oh man, I don't know what I'm gonna put in these last like four pages that they're giving to me.
That's awesome. I make children's books for my nieces and nephews just for fun. And I made one recently and I was like, well, you have to fill up 15 pages or like 16 pages. And I was like, I've never had to do that before. And then I opened it up and I just left them blank. And I was like, oh, I just never thought about this before. And now I'm thinking about it. So that makes sense.
So in terms of like art, what would you say is your style and what are you kind of drawn to as an artist and illustrator?
I love really interesting looking mark making. I think that's something that I hadn't thought about really consciously until I started developing my own style, but I really love when you can like tell how a mark was made and it feels really confident and like somebody, they knew where something had to be and they were just able to take a brush or a nib or a pen or something and just kind of scrape it across the page to get something that it's making an image, it's building up something, a story, a person, a tree, whatever, but you can still see how it was made and see that sort of tool behind it, because it's such a fascinating look into just sort of the person who made it. Like, you can't, there's that tiny little bit that pulls you out to remember, like, this isn't just a story that appeared, like somebody made all of those lines and those marks and pushed them together.
I love that. Well, it makes me think too, listeners are going to groan because I've ranted about Monstress by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda so much, but like the art in that, there's so many of these fine lines and like brush strokes, like you mentioned, that it's like, imagine the amount of time.
I mean, Sana Takeda's work is insane. It's gorgeous.
Phenomenal.
And it truly is. You looking at everything like, this is so much work went into every single page of this that you made.
So M's for Monster draws some inspiration from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Why did you think that why did the story of Frankenstein resonate with you and lead to a retelling based on identity and grief?
So I think when I was first conceptualizing the story, I was drawn to not the sort of full original text of Frankenstein, but the sort of popular mythos behind it, of the very, very simple idea of somebody creating life and then being like, that's not what I wanted. I wanted it to be something else, or not this. I don't know why this is happening to me, the person who made this being. And that felt to me to be a very obvious parallel to a parent-child relationship, which I think is fairly obvious on the surface of it, is this creating life, but that secondary level of, I had a plan for this thing that I made. I know exactly what it's going to be, and it's not following my plan of how I wanted this to turn out, is felt very much like what I wanted to explore of, and it's not, I think my story, and this is partially because I have a hard time being mean to my characters, it's not an unsympathetic story to my sort of Dr. Frankenstein character, Francis. I think there is a kind of reasonable expectation when approaching having a kid or bringing somebody to life, making something like that, of, you don't approach having a kid going like, and I have no expectations for what this child shall be. It is a blank slate, and I'm not even going to consider its future at all. Like that's truly an impossible feat to ask anybody to do. It's just that ability to let go of those preconceived notions. That's the tricky part. And obviously I've made it a lot harder because this is Frances trying to bring back somebody specific to life. This isn't just I'm making a new child. This is I am bringing somebody I know and love back to life, and it has to be this person. And then being faced with somebody who is not that person, which is a very, it's kind of understandable on all sides as being just not a great situation.
Yeah.
No, it's very heart-wrenching, this entire book, just seeing it from all sides, because I feel like you've made a lot of characters that you just resonate with and have every understanding of where they're coming from, but where they may be falling short in some areas. So it's kind of like you said,
they're never true villains.
No. Frances isn't sitting there saying, I hope M is unhappy so that I can get my sister back. It's always kind of that. Well, and so to break it down for listeners who haven't read M is for Monster, Frances is trying to bring back her sister after her sister passes away, and ends up bringing back a different person in Moira's body. And this person goes by M, and it's just a lot about self-discovery and who am I if I'm not the person that I'm expected to be, kind of, and what it means for Frances to try to force, her sister into being when it's not her sister anymore. I did wonder, though, what made you interested in focusing on the loss of a sibling for this? Because I feel like that's not a relationship that's often looked at in media, like the loss of a sibling.
Yeah, I went through so many different iterations of this story as I was developing it and writing it. And I think I always came back to this, if not a sort of biological sibling relationship, then something a little bit more sort of equal of a relationship than that of a parent and a child. And I'm not 100% sure why I did it. I will say of all the sort of different relationships I could have pulled from, I have more experience being a sister than I have zero experience being a parent beyond having a cat. And I don't have a lot of experience sort of in like idea of romantic attachment and loss. So that wasn't really something I wanted to examine with this. And I think I just, I saw a little bit of, I see myself in all of my characters. Like I'm a little bit of M and a little bit of Moira and a little bit of Frances. But I also have a younger sister who's, I think, going in a very different direction than I did. And I'm excited for that for her. And also, I know it's scary to see sort of a path and realize that that's not necessarily the path that you're meant to be on. As an older sibling, I don't want her to follow exactly in my footsteps because I think she would be really unhappy doing that. And I don't want her to have that pressure ever. So there's a little bit of that in, and my sort of that message for my sister in this book, as well as a little bit of that message for me in this book. It's all there. I think there's every generation, all of those expectations, they're inescapable. And being able to sort of see them for what they are and decide what you want to do with them, whether you want to take them on or, take some, leave some, throw some out the window. That's a part of it.
I'm so jealous none of my older sisters ever wrote a graphic novel about how I didn't need to follow in their footsteps. How dare they?
Maybe part of the reason like Hannah and I connected with this book so much is because she and I both only have sisters. And I think like for me, I have a younger sister, so I kind of felt very connected to Frances, and it's one of those things where it's like you maybe don't want them to be exactly like you, but you're trying to put some of your hopes and dreams into them. Like, don't we like some of the same things? Don't you want to
Yeah.
watch this thing with me? And I just really kind of connected with that portrayal because I felt like Frances was so well done, and I really appreciated the way that her grief for Mora was shown and that many of her actions, no matter how frustrating, were steeped in a lot of guilt that she felt for Mora's death. And I was kind of wondering if this character was difficult for you to create and what it was like to try and show Frances's grieving process through your art.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, I feel like Frances was very easy for me to write. Of all of the characters, like I said, the story's gone through tons of iterations, and I think Frances is the only character other than this concept of a sort of a childlike Frankenstein's monster character that is remained remarkably similar to when I first started writing the story. And that's not to say that the sort of specifics haven't changed. I like to throw out the details that at some point, and you can see this in my like really early drafts, at some point Frances was a robot. And at some point Frances was a time traveler, and there was a very brief moment where Frances was a soul trapped in a skull. And so all of those pieces absolutely don't show up anywhere, but this idea of Frances as a character has always felt very strong to me. And I feel like her grief just made sense. And it's not necessarily coming from a specific experience of mine or anything like that. It was just very easy to sort of trace this emotional through line from losing this sister, who I picture as being kind of her entire world. They were very similar. They liked all the same things, at least, you know, in that way of a little sister tagging along and maybe humoring their older sister for some things. To track that loss to all of actions Frances is trying to take to try to sort of regain this lost time, to try to bring back, you know, her lost sister, to try to just constantly be grappling with trying to hold on to these pieces of a life that she loved that's kind of falling apart in her hands.
That's amazing. That's just such a good breakdown of her character. I really adored Frances throughout this entire novel, or graphic novel. It was just amazing. But I adored all your characters. I thought that they were so wonderful on the page. And what I really loved was especially your play with M and Mora. I was not expecting it when I even listened to your discussion. I just wasn't expecting it to leap off the page the way it did. It was so impressive. M is able to talk to Frances's sister throughout the story, using mirrors and reflections. And what was it like kind of developing like the characters playing off of each other? They're in the same, you know, they were in the same body at different points. They have different feelings and they're communicating with one another and kind of bouncing off. What was it like developing that relationship between those two?
Yeah, I mean, so I knew that I wanted that relationship to exist. There came a point in time where I was like, well, I want M to be 100% sure that she's not Mora. And I think the best way to have that happen is for her to be like, I know I'm not Mora because Mora is right there. And I can see her and I can talk to her. And that's not me because I'm me. And so I think for a while I wasn't really sure how I wanted to do that. But I've realized as I sort of write more stories that I have a tendency to come back to this one like mirror motif identity, you know, sense of identity thing. Like I love thinking about mirrors as a storytelling device. And so this idea of seeing a ghost in a mirror who is who you think you're supposed to be just worked really well for me.
It was so cool.
Yeah. And, you know, I think I had a sense kind of because I knew who Frances was of who Mora was going to be. And so I was able to to play off that of this sort of slightly exasperated younger sister who does love many of the things that her older sister does, and has followed her all over the place like a little lost duckling for ages, and then somebody who just wants to feel sort of love and warmth because she doesn't. That's this one thing that's been nice in this brand new big old scary world, and just trying to hold on to that. And I think I was able to develop their personalities just as I had them like play off against each other, and as I tried to write sort of dialogue back and forth.
Yeah, I think it was really well done too, because like the way that it's almost like water like with the reflections. I really thought that was cool because it's almost like a conversation with someone who is there all the time, really, because they constantly feel like Mora is kind of in the room with them. Francis and M too. They all just kind of feel Mora's presence all the time or want Mora to be there. So it was really well done with that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Francis's partner, Jin, because they are phenomenal. They're like the sweetest person ever, because all throughout like Francis like having all this anxiety and going through all these things and like being upset and not understanding what's going on, it seems like Jin just like kind of notices right from the get-go, like, yeah, something's up and I'm not gonna push it, but let's just let it simmer for a bit and let Francis come to the realization. What was it like to create this character, and how much did you love them?
I mean, I love them very dearly. And Jin is a fan favorite. The only like memes I've ever had anybody make of this book was somebody on Tumblr who made a bunch of memes that were specifically just like, I love and respect Jin.
The perfect partner.
Yeah, perfect partner. And I wanted sort of somebody to cut the tension. I've got a couple of different characters. I think really early versions of, I guess, this form of the book, like not as far back as Robot Francis, but like, early in me knowing kind of what I was doing. Jin had a much bigger part to play. It originally, the story was a lot more focused on Jin and Francis and this sort of prickly, mad scientist and somebody coming along to pull them out of their shell. And so they really just, I keep saying this, but they just made sense to me. I just had fun. They were just fun to write. And I also had this sense of, knowing about somebody who's left somebody else's life, but not having really gotten to know them. Like, I think Jin, if anything, if at all, maybe met Mora once or twice, but not enough to develop this relationship, so that it was far easier for them to see kind of what Francis was doing and this like weird disconnects and sort of uncomfortability that was harder for Francis to see because she was so invested and involved in this whole process. And if for her admitting that M isn't Mora would be way harder than it is for somebody who is able to be kind of outside of it. And I also mentioned I have a really hard time being mean to my characters. And so I kind of wanted somebody there who could like offer that comfort to any and all of my characters.
Yeah.
You succeeded because I loved Jin so much.
All the characters are great. I think that you can take, as a reader, you can connect with all of them in different ways.
Well, and I feel like you had a lot of supporting side characters who were also all wonderful. It was a good collection of people in that found family you were kind of discussing you liked seeing. And it felt like, Francis is this huge force of nature who doesn't see what's going on right in front of her, but the other side characters kind of catch on a lot faster to what's going on with M. So it feels like you wanted to show how almost people needed that distance from the situation to fully understand that. And was that the goal with like all of those characters, or was it just one of those things where you were like, no, it made sense when I was writing it and then it felt good afterwards?
I don't know if it was a fully conscious decision on my part. I have a deep love for any story that has like little old ladies just kind of doing their thing. Especially like little old ladies, and you see this a lot more in older stories, like little old ladies that are like really two good friends living together as in one house.
Just
Oh
roommates.
boy, just
and
roommates.
They were roommates.
And they were roommates. Oh my god. So I wanted to write these two elderly characters into it as these kind of nosy neighbors, coming out and just kind of poking at stuff and seeing what happens. But as this kind of benevolent, slightly chaotic force. And Dottie and Asha are both that for me. I mean, Dottie's definitely based on sort of amalgamation of this idea of like a kindly grandma character, but a little bit of like my own sort of Chinese aunts and grandparents and stuff like that. And I also, there's something fun about, and if I can go on a complete tangent here, pulling in what I call my grandmother, which is Popoa. So I had brought in this idea of being like, this is Dottie Popoa. It doesn't necessarily mean that she's your grandmother. It's just kind of what you call everybody of the generation above you, which is very much my experience, because I think I remember the first time that I saw like Gong Popo or Oma and Opa, which I call my dad's parents, show up in a book. And I was like, oh my God, like you just did that. And like I felt seen. And it was like such a small little detail of like, that's my experience. And I want to do that.
That's great.
I loved them so much. I loved how much Frances was like, I cannot do idle chit chat with them. Why are they here? So it was amazing. A lot of this book, not to bring it all back to grief, but something I wanted to highlight was I love how much you look into Mora's grief of someone who feels like she has to witness all of these things going around her while understanding she can no longer be a part of it. And what was it like kind of delving into that type of psyche and questioning for a character? Because she does have to like see it all through a reflection.
Yeah. I mean, just from the base concept of it, the the grief that you must feel as a ghost, seeing the people that you know and love around you and not being able to interact with them. What's worse, like seeing them mourn you and kind of like almost destroy themselves with those emotions is heartbreaking. To add another layer of that, of like seeing your own body moving around and being lost as someone else, is, I just can't imagine what that brings. I mean, I can't imagine, and I did imagine, and then I tried to put it on paper. But it's really brutal.
Yeah.
And I think, even in my story, Mora is putting on a pretty brave face for M, because I think that there's so much more in there. Because it's not just that she's a ghost here because her body is moving around. It's also because of her regrets. It's because she sees that her death made Frances sort of crumble, and that Frances is blaming her for this. I mean, I've read some really beautiful stuff about the idea of ghosts holding on, like the hold of ghosts coming from both directions, of both the ghost having some attachment to the living, but also the living having an attachment to a ghost, and sort of not being able to be released from either end. And so it was just something really heartbreaking to play with, which sounds bad. That sounds bad that I'm like, it was awful, and then I like smushed it all over the place with my little grubby artist hands. But that I was able to, pun kind of intended, like mirror that grief in the different characters and in their response to the situation.
as a youngest sister, because Laura talked about being an oldest sister and feeling seen, like that made me feel seen of like, I will tear myself into trying to make my sisters happy and like knowing that I might not be able to do that, but like I will do this through any means necessary. I thought that was very good for, especially for like a youngest sibling who sometimes will like, they want to make their oldest sibling happy. So I thought that was really beautiful. And I wasn't expecting it when Mora had those types of reactions, but every time she did, I was like, no, of course she'd be having that reaction. This is incredibly difficult for her too. So I thought you did a wonderful job of just smushing that all over the page and showing that heartache.
Yeah.
So we talked previously that this is a book about self-discovery and expression, and Em is learning about herself and her interests and working past expectations that are set for her. And we get to see some of her journey, but I was kind of wondering, we don't get this part on the page. Like, what are some more of the interests that you kind of foresaw for Em, and like what's more of Em's style, and where does Em go?
Em learns to love messes. And I think I've always had her learning to sew, and I know I briefly touched on that.
Yeah.
But that's something that's very personal for me. I love sewing. And I always, there's the obvious sort of reference of her own stitches and being able to sort of stitch herself back together, and whether she hides those stitches or shows them off as a part of herself, as a part of who she is, as a part of how that separates her from Mora. And so I really want her to follow that. And I know she does. She makes herself a whole new wardrobe so that she's not wearing the clothes of a dead girl, and
too many
builds
collars.
all that up. Yeah, exactly. She gets rid of that collar, she gets rid of the stripes, she hates the stripes, she goes for more patchworks and plaids and anything outside of that. And I really see her as just in the way of a character who starts from nothing, but with the sort of brain functionality of an adult, just wants to learn everything. Like, as a baby, you don't know how to do anything, but you also don't really have the capacity to like learn a bunch of skills quite yet. She's got the base level down. And so I think she's just excited to, and this is very much reflects who I am as a person, just like learn lots of stuff, making things. I bet she helps, Jin go around and fix other old ladies' fences and stuff, and, learns woodworking and, I don't know, printmaking and baking and all these things to just, make stuff herself, which is a really cool parallel to sort of being made and being put together. I also, and this is something that is kind of like an author's headcanon, where I'm like, people, it's not in the text, so nobody has to pick it up at all. Like, I'm not gonna come in here and pull sort of a J.K. Rowling and be like, Dumbledore's gay, bye. And to like mess with people, like, but I really think that with the role models that she has, and would end up probably adopting like a non-binary identity, and maybe pronouns. I'll use she, her for most of it, just because that's what's in the book, and that's sort of, I don't think being told, hey, you're Mora, she would have thought to question that for a while yet, but having Jin there as character who uses they them pronouns and is like super positive influence, and this idea of like, well, I don't have to be what Mora was, and I know Mora was a girl, and so like I don't necessarily have to follow that. I can very, very easily see that being this direction of kind of just sort of being like, that's another part of Mora that I'm not necessarily keeping with me. And I love that for her.
I love that because it's just it seems like just a big journey of becoming oneself in so many different ways.
Yeah.
It's exciting that she gets to do that journey, or they get to do that journey, whatever she decides. So that's awesome.
Whatever.
I know you said that like you are a huge sewer and you are an artist. What was it like doing a little bit more of the sciencey portions of this graphic novel?
Can I just mention, was the shell stain theory like a total call out to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein.
Absolutely. And also, you're the first person who's ever brought that up to me, and it's incredibly exciting.
Okay, good. I was like, because I noticed it, I was like,
You want to know why? Because Laura was a science major, so she's like, I was there for really the sciencey things.
I mean, so it's a whole lot of bull, obviously. I know very little past sort of, I went through all of the classes in high school. I did a good job because I was a huge, I was a nerd and I was a goody two shoes, so I wanted to do my best. But past like a AP physics level of knowledge about science, I don't know anything. What I do know is a lot of like Star Wars and Star Trek ability. Oh yes,
listeners, I'm wearing my Star Wars shirt.
And like ability to convincingly BS science stuff,
like the timey-wimey stuff of the Doctor
Who the timey-wimey stuff, or like a Star Trek episode where they're like, quick, we've got to go to the Jeffries tubes to recalibrate the flux inhibitors on the warp drive because they're out of alignment. It's causing the deflector dish to fall off the roof.
Or the Daleks can fly now.
Yeah, and just having enough there and like committing to it hard enough to be like, this, yeah, sure. And also, like, I did myself the favor of like, I was like, this is very much magic taken seriously like a science, which I think is a fantastic trope in books, is like, yeah, if there was magic, there would be people who were analyzing that, like turning it into a science and like, all right, how does this fit together? How does this work? All right, if I can do this, why can't I do this other thing? If I can bring a frog back to life, why can't I, do that over here? And so, you can get away with a lot of that if you're like, this part sounds good enough, and if anybody questions it, it's magic.
Do you have like an idea of like, maybe you haven't gotten into this deep, but do you have like an idea of like how the magic system in the world works? Or
I have a lot of notes. I wrote like a scientific proposal for Francis to be giving to like a scientific institution at some point about this, that was all about this sort of interconnected idea of, what holds together people to each other, this sort of connection of like mental connection of how you kind of always exist in somebody else's brain, like they're a part of you and you have this piece of you that is connected to them through your interactions with them, through their understanding of you, and that you've got pieces of that with everybody in this kind of massive web of connections, and that everybody has a little bit of a piece of you, and that if you were suddenly gone, because everybody's holding the other end of these strings, they could kind of piece you back together. But if you think about that too hard, none of the book makes sense. So I kind of threw that to the way. So I have thought
about all of that.
I have thought about it a lot, but if you get too in the weeds of the science, you have to actually really think about it and kind of follow those threads, and then it stops then it stops being a sort of comprehensible story at all.
So we cannot expect future ones where we have Professor Tam Tam lectures a la Monstress.
No, you cannot.
When we read Monstress, we were like, I don't understand how the world building works. And one of our friends is like, you do not read Professor Tam Tam's lectures. That's what you're not doing. So
it's so hard to write a character that really seems incredibly smart. That's something that I have a lot of admiration for people who can write somebody who's not just like, hey, look at that, there's that smart person over there, and then everyone goes, woo, yeah, it's the smart person. Then you're like, we as the reader know that person is smart, but like somebody who is demonstrably smart and intelligent and like approaches things from that angle. I think it's absolutely fascinating and not something I feel fully capable of doing.
I will say that I feel like a lot of times when Hannah and I have been reading books and characters are specifically like addressed as being, oh, that's the smart person, or this one's a genius, she and I are very quick to be like, they're such an idiot, they forgot this, or they didn't do that.
And you don't want to do that because that it kind of sets your reader on the lookout.
Yeah,
prove you
that's
wrong.
Exactly what it does.
I much prefer the BoJack Horsemans of the world where he's like, I went to the business store and I did a business today. I'm like, nope, I love that. That's so amazing.
You're like, yeah, absolutely. I will accept that. Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I wanted to ask about the science because I was like, I don't know if she's like super into science or not, but I appreciate that you're like, no. It is Star Trek and Star Wars, and that is all. So.
I will say, I do know a lot about sewing. And kind of what I wanted to do was, again, visually, I was like, I need to design a bunch of crazy looking science fiction machines. You know, I had to design a whole laboratory that kind of looked mad sciencey. And I ended up, and this is just like a fun detail, pulling on a lot of diagrams of old like weaving and sewing equipment from like the Industrial Revolution, of like spinning jennies and sort of like, you know, any kind of automated weaving machines, when, you know, beyond sewing machine, kind of like what the inside of a sewing machine looks like, and pulling that together and like using that as a jumping off point for these sort of crazy mechanical things, just kind of as like a fun inside joke to me, because I've, you know, obviously, you know, M is stitched back together, and my whole sort of scientific concept was this idea of like threads and pulling stuff together, and so it's all very like textile metaphor-y for me, which is more in my wheelhouse than sort of mad science itself.
I can't wait to like reread it and look at all those photos and be like, I know what those are for.
Yeah.
Please correct me if I'm misremembering, but I do remember during the talk that you said you were kind of finishing up this novel while you were preparing to move across country. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
How was that, and how are you still alive?
It was terrible. It was a terrible idea. Again, it was sort of had to happen out of this, like, listen, you took too long writing the dang thing, and now we're running out of time for you to get this art done. But I had this opportunity. I was offered this sort of teaching fellowship straight out of grad school at a college. And when you get an MFA in anything, probably, but specifically in comics, there's like not a lot that you can do with that. So the concept of being able to teach was like not something I could pass up at all. And I was actively driving from Los Angeles to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, while I was supposed to be inking all of these pages. So at least for the first leg of the journey, before I started to kind of give up a little bit, I would like whip out my whole tablet setup, like my computer, my tablet, all like huge, massive bundle of connective cords and like dongles and stuff in like whatever capacity this hotel room or motel room had in terms of like a desk, and setting up there, and then trying to ink a couple of pages like after driving all day.
People in the hotel parking lot like, why is that person bringing all that equipment in there?
Mad scientist indeed.
I don't recommend it, but you know, it did get done, so it clearly worked to some extent.
Do you think your students will use this against you if you ever tell them not to procrastinate? They're like, but you procrastinated finishing your book.
I have given them so much fodder to use against me. I'm a big proponent of, listen, I didn't do a great job with this, but I know that's not how I should have done it. And I'm trying to teach you how you should do it. You're free to follow me, but you should know I will have done you a disservice if I let you think it's a good idea, what I've done here.
That's awesome.
Talia, do you have any projects that you're like currently working on?
I have a couple of things that are sort of in the works, unannounced, where I'm doing more art and less of the writing stuff. And my own sort of writing stuff, I've been basically struggling in that like terrifying sense of, I did it once. I really hope I can do it again, and that wasn't a one-off. I've been struggling with that for the last like 3 years, just like trying to write, and that's part of what I talked about earlier, of not really knowing my process and trying just anything, free writes, really structured stuff, you know, drawing the characters, trying to figure all that stuff out, and I hope it pulls together. I have more pieces. I mean, obviously you don't work on something off and on for 3 years without getting somewhere, but sometimes it feels like it's just kind of going in some kind of crazy spiral, spinning off one loop after another into the distance, going laterally rather than actually moving forward to something. But it is something I'm working on.
Can I ask about some of your illustrations on your website?
Yeah.
So I was looking
like,
at
are you working on anything? But also, I saw what you're working
I'd like
on,
to buy
and I have
some things. And wondering where to purchase them. But there's this one. Is this a marmoset on a branch?
I'm pretty
with a
sure
little crown.
That was a golden lion tamarin, if I'm thinking about it correctly.
I love it so much. It's the cutest thing I have ever seen. I love that. But some of this is just really unique. I really love how you like mix some of the like animal and like nature and also like mythological characters together. It's really cool. I would highly suggest listeners that you go to Talia's website, taliadutton.com, and check out the illustrations because they're so neat.
As someone who just finished Tears of the Kingdom, I love the Gerudo illustration. I had to pull it up to see, and great job. That was beautiful.
Thank you. Big fan.
We're so sorry that we're just making you look at your website. So.
Totally fine. I've reached a point where I know that I have enough skill to sort of implement ideas that I have. And I think the most joy that I get out of that is using that skill to implement incredibly silly ideas. It brings me a lot of joy. Those aren't really the ones that end up on my website. Those are the ones that sort of get shunted off to like Instagram or Tumblr or whatever. But, I love putting really silly, like two things that I love and swishing them together as sort of one big horrifying compare and contrast essay where I'm like, what about Great British Bake Off and Star Wars? And everyone's like, why did you do this? I'm like, because I could.
Because I want to watch a Romulan bake things. I can't help it.
Right. I wanted to say Darth, Paul, and Maul Hollywood, and I have no excuse for that.
That's amazing. I love that so much. Everyone go check out all of her mashups on Instagram and Tumblr because that sounds amazing. So, yeah. Talia, can you tell us something you're reading, watching, and or enjoying right now?
Yes, I can. I just read, it's a book that I got a while ago, but I have a huge to be read pile. It's a graphic novel by Ryan North and Erica Henderson called Danger and Other Unknown Risks. And it's I know listeners can't see this, but I have it here, and it's
that's beautiful.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful graphic novel, but it's also this really cool blend of like sci-fi, post-apocalyptic, and also like a little bit of magic mixed in there vibes.
Adds to cart.
With some really cool twists and just like, again, like, awesome characters that you just love, and they've got great chemistry with each other and banter, but it's also this idea of the apocalypse and where does the world go from there, and how do you hold it together, how do you keep all the pieces there, and the world is kind of splitting apart, but it's like clever and funny and colorful and bright and just really cool to look at.
I will be picking that up at the library. So.
Yes. Yeah, highly recommend.
And where can our listeners find you or find your book?
Yeah, so my book can be purchased, I think, from a lot of bookstores, or at least online bookstores. I would love it if you supported your local indie bookstore, if they have it, or if you ask them, they can, I'm sure, order it for you. But I have my website, as already mentioned, is taliadutton.com. And on Instagram, I'm at Super Taya, which is super_TAYA. Yeah, that's where most of my stuff goes. I think Tumblr is more of if you find me, that's meant to be, and I'm not going to send you there necessarily, because that's just how that sort of wild frontier works. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, we want to thank you so much
Thanks
for
so
coming on the
much.
podcast, and thank you for writing this book because we both
We
adored
loved it.
I did
Thank you so much for reading it.
I did buy my copy at a local bookseller, and it is signed by Talia, so I feel very important doing this. It was wonderful getting to have you on. Everyone, go buy Talia's book. Go read
Yes.
it. It is amazing. It's the best
You'll love
time.
it.
And, drop a follow on Instagram where you get to see some zany mashups, or check out her website where Laura is going to be hounding her for a purchase soon. So
We'll take it into advisement.
Thank you guys so much. And please join us next week as we continue our Year of the Dresden coverage, where we look at a skull with a soul in it that is a little bit more perverted than Francis is or was.
Not a great version.
No, not a great version. Dresden, Jim Butcher should have taken some notes from you. So.
And you can find us at Our Pod on all the socials, or email us at ourpod@gmail.com, or check out our website at ourpod.com.
Yes. And thank you so much again, Talia. You are welcome back anytime.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.